You are listening to 99.1 WQRT LP Indianapolis, and this is Create Here. Produced by artists and curators from Big Car Collaborative, Create Here is your place to listen to conversations with people making intriguing, innovative, and impactful things happen on the cultural front in Indianapolis, Indiana, and beyond. Find out more and access additional episodes at WQRT.org.
You're listening to Create Here on 99.1 WQRT FM. This is Shauta Marsh, Director of Programs and Exhibitions at Tube Factory Artspace, co-founder of Big Car Collaborative. And today I'm joined by our guest curator, Yashi Davalos. Davalos is an Afro-Puerto Rican Mexican Atlanta native based in New Orleans. Her practice began in the American Deep South. She attended HBCU Savannah State University, where she studied vocal performance. Yashi's curatorial research centers sociocultural epistemology. I'm going to let that live in this recording. The South and Global South through an interdisciplinary arts praxis. Yashi was the 23 through 2025 curatorial fellow and interim grants and awards coordinator at the Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City, Missouri. She was previously a member of collective-run gallery The Front, New Orleans. Davalos has designed and facilitated programming and collaboration with various institutions, including Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art, Prospect, New Orleans, Contemporary Art Center, New Orleans, UMKC Music Conservatory, and Midway Artists Coalition. Her art has been exhibited throughout New Orleans, Atlanta, Kansas City, Missouri, and at Mecca Art Fair in the Dominican Republic. Yashi's writing has been published via 60 Inches from the Center, Burn Away, and Interventions at Latinx Project NYU. Welcome, Yashi.
Hi, Shauta. Thank you for having me. So good to be here.
So you are curating an exhibit with us called SOMA. Do you want to go ahead and tell the audience a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So the concept for SOMA was inspired by two things. I think the first thing was definitely this whole figurative surplus of 2D paintings in the contemporary art market, and sort of the dialogue around how we are engaging with figurative representation, specifically bodies of color. And then it's also very deeply inspired by Brave New World, which was I have a very specific memory that I kind of go to when I'm in the process of organizing the show, where I was in my 10th grade honors lit class at my magnet charter school in the north side of Atlanta, where everyone is bused to go up there. And we're reading this dystopian novel about everyone who's genetically engineered to different castes in society and are taking this recreational drug called SOMA that is pretty much used to pacify all the civilians anytime that they're feeling any sort of negative emotions, to sort of keep them within the compliance of how they understand socializing in their caste. And so I really wanted to focus this show on thinking about and I just remember at the time when I was reading this novel that there were a lot of social intricacies that I really enjoyed, but I felt that because I was growing up on the north side of Atlanta and I had friends from every side of Atlanta reading this book with me in school, that my life was very utopian at the time. And then shortly after high school, I think the city got very hyper industrialized, and that sort of reality that I had a brief moment in was really a foreshadowing. And so it's very that experience very heavily sort of inspires this show. But yeah, so I really wanted to focus the idea of SOMA a little more related to somatic experiences within figurative paintings. And just thinking about this idea of sort of adolescence and your youth and your sense of youth and childhood, and how that transcends through your adolescence into the real world, and how the real world can become very surreal. So yeah, that's pretty much the premise of the show, is sort of thinking about these rite of passages that are very somatic and kind of thinking about those feelings and titling them SOMA.
And you have 5 artists in the show? No, 6. 6 artists in this exhibit. And can you talk about why you selected these artists in particular?
Yeah. So I was really interested in doing a curatorial project with artists that I had engaged in my time in Kansas City. I was based in Kansas City for 2 years for the curatorial fellowship at Charlotte Street. But then I think what really made it more of a granular selection is thinking about primarily painters who engage with like figurative representations of people of color. And I was thinking about people who are painting themselves in their youth. And then also people who were really leaning into like the surreal or the fantastic of themselves. Like, for example, I met October when she had a solo show in Kansas City, Kansas, which is the Kansas side, not the Missouri side. But, she's really into like this idea of like Black Gothic and thinking about that aesthetic and also how like her figures borrow from like African American culture in the Black Gothic, but she's also half Persian. And so thinking about sort of like those cultural and folkloric elements in that. And so I really was drawn to her paintings because they felt very surreal. But a lot of the other painters like Cesar Velez, who's based in Kansas City, and then Isaac, who is also based in Kansas City, they really like paint a lot more towards the immigrant experience. And then I feel like with Cathedral or Catherine Looney, Cathedral sort of like her art name, and then with Joe Archuleta, they really focus more on like the feminine for me. And so I was really thinking about that too. Is like, when is femininity transcend? Like, when does that transcend into these like female archetypes? And for me, I really see that happening a lot, sort of in like a young lady's adolescence. And then with Tommy, he does these very really like intricate sculptures that are inspired by like Aztec heads and like sort of like pre-Columbian figures. But then he sort of takes this new like inspired twist and then does like candy paint jobs on them. And so I'm really interested into like figuring out what moments feel more like imaginary versus feeling more like an actualized memory in the show. Yeah.
So the artists in the show are Joe Archuleta, and please correct me if I mispronounce any of these names, but I think you and I will be easy on each other as we both have names that frequently get mispronounced. But the artists in the show, Joe Archuleta, Tommy Lomelli, Catherine Looney, October Sherfai, Isaac Tapia, and Cesar Velez.
Yes, that's correct.
So, so you met most of these artists during your fellowship, your curatorial fellowship in Kansas City. And when would you say you started piecing them together, connecting them in your mind?
I think when I was preparing for this show, I didn't exactly know just yet who I wanted to select, but I knew that I wanted to really chase this dystopian concept. And I knew that I feel like lately I've been playing a lot more with liminal space and thinking about like experimental installation. And so I really wanted to take this opportunity to like almost challenge how I've been thinking about figures and performance and then taking it back to the 2D. Obviously with Tommy, he's 3D because he does sculpture, but also even just considering like the object versus monument and how it's sort of like a still presence. And then thinking about how still figures can communicate like these outer body experiences. And so I feel like in the time that I was in Kansas City, whether locally or nationally, like altogether, I did over 75 studio visits over the 2 years. So it was a lot. So, and also during that time, like I did an art fair in the Dominican Republic. I went to Freeze. I went to Like I did all the fairs that were out in LA that like last year, like Freeze, Felix, and Spring Break, and I probably went to between like smaller and big cities, about 15 different cities. And like a big part of the mission and the fellowship was to really think about, you know, what are artists like creating in their studios and how does that live like on a national level? But also like a big conversation that was happening too at Charlotte Street was this idea of like, you know, how does regionalism happen between artists in the Midwest? And so I thought that this would be a great opportunity to like really think about artists who had either been based in Kansas City or had shown there at some point in their career and bring them specifically to Indy and to see how that lives out with this curatorial concept.
And some things you were saying, like, do you feel like adolescence is a dystopian experience?
I feel like it's somewhere in between. And I think it's like sort of a time where you start to kind of really create these touch points between how you're perceiving yourself versus society and like who you'll grow into becoming. I think that like in a lot of ways, like, you know, the young mind makes things like what the way they think of things, it makes it very big, like very grandiose. In a lot of ways, like our initial attachments are really to these like big ideas. But as we age, we sort of chase them back through like real memories in real time and how they like created value. But I also think like the dissonance you experience early on, like is a sort of a touch point in your brain that can either like transcend or get a lot deeper. And so I think that it's sort of in adolescence where like your idea of what you think utopia or dystopia is really starts to like formulate, and you start to ask yourself those questions, like how much of this is like the reality I'm living in versus like me feeling like I'm not able to be myself or I'm becoming myself and it's disruptive. Yeah.
When you were thinking about this concept, did you think about like, were there differences you saw in works of white artists who were exploring adolescence and artists of color with this topic a bit?
Yeah, I think that all of them have very different motivations for their work. I almost kind of feel like a lot of the times when I curate, I feel like it's very experimental and research based. So I feel like when I propose a concept, like during the fellowship, I had this concept where it was like, I knew I want to make a show around, you know, how infrastructure was broken in Atlanta around the 96 Olympics. But what the show ended up really becoming was like an installation performance-based show that like played with liminal space a lot. And so there was sort of these like moments in that exhibition that alluded to like performance. Yeah, but then I really kind of look back at my notes of, you know, I think when I look in when I conduct a studio visit, I really do start in the place of like what's physically in the space, but I'm really into like what's the artist's process and what their ethos is. And so I think one thing that I do feel like is a common thread, even though they're making between all these artists, even though they're making them for very different reasons, is that they have a very experimental way of like playing with figures. I think with Isaac and Caesar, it's like in some ways they're trying to romanticize these figures that are tied to memories in their life that they adorn. And I think the same with Catherine. But I feel like with Jo, she's really more into like, I think what I would describe as the somatic experience where like her figures are more hyperbolic. And so I'm really interested in that. But like so much of that for her is tied to like her girlhood and being like a middle daughter and being multiracial. And so I'm really interested in that. It's just like how we perceive the self and how does that like equate to how the artist wants to paint the figure? You know, are you painting from a family archive? Are you painting in the imaginary? And then with Tommy, I really love this idea of how like it can fit in many contexts, their sculpture. There's this idea of like making like neo pre-Columbian work and thinking about like what that means, and also making them so large in a contemporary space where they feel less like an object because they're so large and they feel more like just a big monument. But then also with the aesthetic play that they have on it, like it speaks very much to like Chicano culture, and they're from Stockton, California originally. They were based in KC and were a Charlotte Street resident until they recently moved to Montana to take on their Archie Bray fellowship. But they just, they work in really large ceramics and they hardly ever glaze. They're just like sculpting and then doing these lowrider paint jobs on them. So I think they all have a different approach to like how they are translating their attachment to figures. And some of it gears more towards like translating an archive versus like living in the imaginary. And so I think that really does tie to SOMA and thinking about more specifically, like this imagined idea of like, how do we, when a figure is still, how does it communicate emotion to us? Yeah, or just outer body experiences.
Were the works communicating an emotion to you and individually? Are you wanting the audience to have those feelings as they move through the space? Can you talk a little bit about what you would like the audience to experience through the work?
Yeah, I think there is sort of like a back and forth between like these these paintings that have multiple figures that are just like different family members, and then sort of like the single subject figures. And then I think like with Isaac and with Caesar and Catherine, they're like very specifically related to family, and I think that's going to really like translate immediately. It's very straightforward in the gallery, but I think seeing it next to something that feels like a familiar figure but feels young, in the sense that the figure may be young or the figure may be just like in a very emotional state, I think is going to kind of create this dialogue of like, what's the relationship between like who you are in like the privacy of your home and who you are in like these cherished moments versus like what's going on in this like painting next to it. There's one painting where the subject is like floating above itself. And so I think a lot of like how we first start to identify our sense of self is like thinking about how attached is it to the way that we were raised versus like how we want to sort of transcend or like break the binaries of how we were raised. So I think that's going to be like the majority of the paintings is going back and forth between like the self versus the collective. And I think in the center of the gallery, I have Tommy's Aztec head, which is really large. And so I think that sort of feeling like a destination point in the gallery will sort of like allow people to sort of create these like gravitational loops of like, what painting do you feel more comfortable standing in front of based on the activity that's going on in front of it. So I kind of like feel like that's something that I'll be looking forward to opening night, is seeing how much people are sort of like ping-ponging across the gallery, because most of it will be on the wall except for this one centerpiece. So I'm trying to see how much people gravitate to and from the center. Yeah.
With the exhibit and seeing how people relate to it, do you think that will, do you feel like you'll take away any set ideas?
Yeah, I think I'm really trying to invoke like this emotion in people that is like, I guess I'm sort of like creating this social paradigm in the gallery that makes people think about like their attachment to figures. I feel like the more surrealist, like very somatic out of body experience, like paintings and then the sculpture that are in the gallery, I feel like are very like they evoke certain emotions out of someone because they present being like in an altered state versus like being in a more poised state. Like if you're like some of these paintings that are like familial, like they are from like actual moments where you're like getting ready to take a picture, And so I think that's what I'm trying to sort of pose the question of, is what is our attachment to like the black and brown body in different settings. And I think that's something that I kind of find myself going back to. Like, I think I saw a tweet from someone who was like during a residency, and they're like, Jesus Christ, like there are 75 figurative paintings in here. Like not everybody is going to be Kehinde Wiley. Like you guys need to create a nuance of what is special about the way that you are communicating or validating these figures in like a space. And I think a lot about figures without the figures actually being present in most of my work. Like I think more in liminal space, I think in the interdisciplinary, I think in performance. And so I'm sort of like setting the place that the figure will perform more often than not in my exhibitions. And this is probably one of the only, maybe the few times that I've ever thought to myself, like, let me not just like think about archive or think about how the figurative is related to archive or to like history around the body, and thinking about just like in the present and feeling and how is that transcendent. And so and also just relating it back to this novel that's very dystopian. I just think there's something really interesting about that to me, thinking about like how the somatic can be a distraction. But it can either be, my personal belief is that it can either be a distraction or it can be the thing that propels you into like clarity or into like radicalizing your life. And so I think that for me, that's the biggest takeaway of this show, is seeing how people are really reacting to having so much breathing space with 2D works. So the gallery is quite large, and I think there's only really about 8 pieces, but I feel like they're all like a piece that you want to spend a lot of time with. And so for me, that's sort of like a curatorial research thing for me, where like it's a little different than how I normally work, but it definitely informs like how I want like liminal space as it's related to the body to be designed. Yeah.
So let's pivot towards your career and how you got to this point. Can you tell us a bit about your background, more about that?
Yeah, so for a very long time, I was only, or not only, but I was primarily studying voice, like from 4th grade through college. That was my primary focus. And when I was in high school, like I was in the magnet program at North Springs Charter High School, which is it's like one of the only 2 magnet charter schools like in Fulton County. The other one is like the one that Outkast went to, so it's on the south side of Atlanta. But so I feel like during that time I really started to become a lot more interdisciplinary, but didn't really realize it. I just had a lot of disciplines that I was very rigorous in. Like I had a lot of honors classes and literature. I was in the theater program as like a secondary focus. And I really struggled with how I was going to pursue them in academia outside of this setting where I could sort of do them all at once. Like you can't have 3 to 4 majors unless you have sort of like a designed major that somehow like incorporates all of them. And so after college, I had like this social programming platform that was primarily based in like research or epistemology based writing. Because I kind of thought to myself, like, I didn't really want to be like in the music industry as like an artist. I felt like it closed me off a lot. And so I was just heavy and sort of, there's like a big like bookstore culture in Atlanta that is like all the archivists are connected to it. All the people in academia are connected to it. And sort of like, this is our third space where we start to like confront each other and talk to each other about like how we're experiencing like these social experiences in real time. And so I had like a social programming platform based off of that at first. And I was in event production, and like a lot of the corporations like fund most of the arts, whether they're like performance or event based or visual art in Atlanta. Like Georgia is like 48 out of 50 for state funding in the arts. But in Atlanta, you don't really see a lot of scarcity. What you see is like people going to get those big marketing budgets with pitch decks, which is something I used to like help do. And so when I moved to New Orleans after college in 2017, I had that program for a while. I had the platform for a little while and was sort of back and forth between Atlanta. I've always kind of split my time between New Orleans and Atlanta. And then, but in sort of creating this platform, I was doing all of the content for it. And so I became a photographer and was freelancing doing that at that time. But I thought to myself, like, there were specific things that I wanted to visualize. And so with a portfolio and with a bunch of research concepts, like for curatorial projects, I had joined the Front in New Orleans, which is a collective run gallery. And so I really started incubating like more of the visual art side things there. And from that, I was working still between New Orleans and Atlanta, connecting like different artists in the South to the front. And from there, I had applied for my first curatorial fellowship, which was at the Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City, Missouri. And I really felt like before I took the fellowship, I had a lot of like one-on-one connections with just different consultants, gallerists, who knew me sort of as someone like working in a project space in New Orleans. But I feel like it definitely takes a lot of time and risk-taking choices for people to see that like your vision is bigger than any opportunity that you can get. And so I feel like that really opened up when I joined or when I won the fellowship, because it was a national call. And so I was in Kansas City for 2 years, still primarily based in New Orleans, of course, but was living and working at Charlotte Street and really sort of like upping my game in the administrative capacity, because we were under 100,000 at the front, but we were 1.2 million for our annual budget at Charlotte Street. And so that was a huge jump. And I was managing about 120K of resources in my time between just the different things I did in my role. And I traveled so much, like I did so many things that I felt like I was definitely doing at a slower pace and a smaller scale where I was already, but now I was in a different region doing it for a specific organization. So balancing sort of working for a nonprofit and then being independent as well. And so now I'm back in New Orleans, and during the duration of the curatorial fellowship, I also like created my art writing debut, which was like kind of like a revelation for me, because when I was in college and even in high school, like my professors would get really frustrated with me, like, 'cause I didn't know then, but the way I wrote and the way I did analysis writing and the way I developed my criticism was very like prose oriented, but very like social pedagogy oriented. But I used to always get told like, you kind of write in this like dreamy way, but like in a really critical way. And it's just like, we just really need you to interpret this book. It's and this is someone who's like getting advanced classes throughout high school. But like, I remember I was told that through like one of my professors, and they sort of told like another professor I had, because I went through like a bridge program. So like to get into Savannah State. And so like I was there the summer before my freshman year started. And yeah, by the time like the full fall semester started, like the department chair and my English 1 professor was like, this girl is weird. Like, what do we do about it? But then they like asked me to double major, and I was like, I thought you didn't like me. But what I found was that when I started writing about art, and specifically through like profiles and exhibition reviews, that like every sort of component of like how I am, like my ethos as a writer really does fit into art writing. And so I've been doing a lot of that since I've been back in New Orleans, and then obviously still taking on exhibition contracts like independently, like with this show, and sort of just getting my footing back while I'm like sort of redefining like where I'm at in my career now, because there's this idea of being like a big fish in a small pond, but then I feel like, you know, sort of when you compete more nationally, there's this like chance to really design how you want to maneuver, because you do have like a certain level of visibility that can propel you forward, but it's not like you walk into the perfect situation. It's like you finesse it. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now, is like I'm back finessing. Yeah.
Do you feel the role of the curator has changed, or like how you can move through the world as a curator has changed with there's lots of things affecting it, these moves, but also the change in the government administration?
Yeah, I think personally, just in my practice, I'm always sort of in a unique space, because while I think the work that I do can exist in a museum, I feel like I'm more interested in the interdisciplinary, but also working with like mid-career artists, and sort of breaking them into different opportunities that can like make them more established or propel them to be more established coastally. But I feel like where that has sort of landed me, because I'm sort of like working in the nonprofit sector primarily, I think the role of the curator is like way more centered now around like artist development. in terms of like curating in a nonprofit space, but also thinking about like how to respond to artist needs. You have to have a relationship with an artist trajectory to do that, because like collectors and private equity have their own interests, and like that dominates the market in a certain way. But how you prepare the artist for that is really, I think, has a lot to do with how curators are researching, not only like academically or even just in the curatorial concepts that they have that like sort of exist between like art history and the contemporary. Like I feel like the role of the curator is now becoming a lot more tied to like artists being weird in their studios, being more experimental, and like designing infrastructures around that, even against like binaries that say art can only exist in a certain way. And so, yeah, it's, I think the curators, but also a lot the artist administrators, because I feel like curators are sort of like doing the experimenting and the polishing as a result of the experimenting with curatorial projects. But I feel like when you're also like an art administrator at a nonprofit, you're developing like long-term programming that like kind of creates the paradigm in which they can like develop that in, outside of just like capstone projects. So yeah, I think that's what I would say is happening now, because I think like when those artists have something unique to say and it's ready, that's when the museums, that's when like the collectors, that's when the contemporary galleries are trying to figure out where to place it. But they're coming in at a much later phase in the artist development, for sure. Yeah.
And you decided to move back to New Orleans. You probably could have gone anywhere. Why did you choose New Orleans as where you want to work from?
Yeah, I just turned 30, and I've been sort of telling people like, yeah, I got maybe like one more fellowship left in me and maybe one more move outside of where I want to be long term. And I think I've really also realized that because I had so much admin capacity in my last role, that it made me think about like the impact of like where I'm going to do that. And so like I kind of have this thing where I just like, I want to live and die in the South. Like that's where I want to be. I'll work with artists from anywhere. I will go anywhere. But most of my research needs to be like in the place that I grew up. Like I think also too, like I've been in New Orleans on and off, or either part-time or full-time since I was 21. So I think for me, like the thing that I'm thinking a lot about right now is sort of like cultural density and how that has shifted as cities are like reorganizing, redesigning, or like go through sort of like their infrastructure changing. And I think there's so much like archival density that I still want to tap into New Orleans. But I think there's something like just in general about the South that I feel like living in a different place in the Deep South has sort of informed what like living in like a large city like Atlanta is home to 6 million people now. And then like New Orleans is like 300,000, I think, just about. So it's a different city, but like everyone in the world comes to New Orleans. So I think there's something about like the South and what it has to say, and like Southern vernacular, or just like social nuance, like in the contemporary, that I'm seeing a lot in visual art. Like I'm seeing a lot of themes between like land and body in specific sites like the Gulf South or Low Country where like the Gullah Geechee live. But also thinking about like classism in the South amongst people of color, like Black classism, Latina classism, and how mobility is possible when there's a stronger collective that's also experiencing it. I think I grew up in a world that I felt like was very utopian, mostly because of the social experience, not necessarily because of money or because of having an advantage over people. Because I feel like in a lot of ways, like my biggest privilege was just like having to socialize and interact with everyone in a Black dominant city. And so New Orleans also shares that too. But one thing I will say about New Orleanians is like, I've never met anyone in my life like that has more self-propriety, because like they have generations going back to the 1700s of that amongst themselves, like, socially, like knowing each other's like grandmas like 3/4 5 generations back, 7 generations back. And then, of course, experiencing Katrina to disrupt a lot of that. But like the way Native New Orleanians carry themselves is like with this understanding of themselves. And I feel like in Atlanta, there's a sense of that, but there's also the question of just like how big can we be? You know, like how rich do we need to be? How do we need to mobilize the collective? And I feel like New Orleans is very much like, we will have it all. And you will come to us and you will answer to us and you will learn how to navigate like all the cultural density of this city through us, because no one knows it better than us. And so I feel like that might be the real reason why I keep coming back, is because like I think every person as they grow really needs peers. And so I feel like having that sort of feedback, even if like I'm not like in the circle, I feel like is the type of discipline that I need to be around when I'm doing all this curatorial research. Because I see a lot of, I've witnessed 3 prospects in my time, which is like the big triennial that they had that is now sunsetted. But I've seen a lot of people come in and out the city because of that. And it's sort of like, I see a lot of conversation around like people from academia or like the North at these big or institutions, or people on the coast, like sending people down to like see what's going on in the South. And it's sort of just like, I want to sort of be the person on the inside, saying like, well, this is what's going on and this is who you need to know. And so I think that's really where my heart is at. But I'm also really interested in like the Black and Brown experience, or just like the interdisciplinary like expression of people in every region. But I think a lot of the research is really tied to specific sites like the Gulf South, or just, like the Black Belt in general. Post-Reconstruction.
One thing you and I talked a bit about is that just because we might be doing exhibits that feature artists of color doesn't mean they're selected just because they're artists of color. There still is a merit that we are, like, they're the best artists. That's why they're getting selected. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I think a lot of the artists that I have worked with, like, I would say maybe it's a 50-50 split of artists who are sort of cultural bearers that are self-taught versus like artists who are more traditional in the sense that they pursued their art career through academia first. And I think one thing that I've like seen a lot in more so in Atlanta, but I feel like also in New Orleans too, because there's a couple, like Joan Mitchell's a prominent residency. But something I see is like when, I think the dialogue of like merit becomes a real, a point of conversation when an artist is more mid-career, but I think what I have seen is that artists are like, a lot of the artists who are culture bearers who are self-taught, but also artists who have just lived in different places in the South who pursue academia and are focused on like Southern pedagogy. I think they're really interested in like translating into contemporary art, like their experiences in real time. And so for me, I think when I'm working with artists, I'm thinking a lot about like, how are you pursuing your medium? And like, are you trying to be more experimental? Like I've seen a lot of people who are like lens based and do more like installation, like surrealist interpretations of photo and liminal space, and like having that be tied to the South and like different sites in the South. And I think for me, I'm really interested in the experimental, but I think merit is something that like you use in order to like excel and to gain more access. But I think for me, it's more so like what are you leveraging with your merit, in terms of like, what's the subjectivity of your work? What's the craftsmanship of your work? What are the resources that you need? And so I think for me, like this idea of like engaging in like cultural specificities really has more to do about like what the contemporary dialogue is, and like what stage is the artist. Like the artist has the voice and the artist has the vision in their studio, but I think where I sort of come in is like, how do I help create that dialogue in a physical space? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to lean towards like, I'm the curator. It's good because I say so. it has merit because I say it has merit.
For me, it's like, it's my point of reference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like I research a lot. But I feel like I'm always asking, how do we visualize it? And so I think what makes the artist work really good to me is that it's just, there's a visual vernacular that makes it really unique. And so I feel like I know I'm right when I'm selecting it, but I feel like the dialogue is bigger than me being right. So,
Well, yeah, it's bigger than that.
But I think I often find that, like, especially when I'm writing and I'm getting edited a lot, I'm just like, sometimes I feel like I'm living in an imaginary world that's just between me and the artist, because when I try to write about how this is very, like, contemporarily Southern, I think sometimes people who are not doing, like, the field work are sort of like, how are you going to defend this by the craftsmanship? Or, you know, they're sort of more in, like, the face value of how to write about the work. And I think I'm more, like, in the theory. But I think that's an interesting conversation, like, in the South right now, is like, what is the South? And how is the antebellum South transcended? And who has done that? And, like, what are Southernisms and things like that? And so I think, like, those conversations are sort of what inspired my curatorial practice. But I think not necessarily from art history practice, but more in the interdisciplinary practice for me has expanded it beyond, like, where the initial research is. Like, just thinking about, like, how does performance exist in an exhibition space, or you know, like, what's interdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary between curatorial projects. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I live, and I think it's very rooted in the South and will be for the majority of my practice. But I think it will also, like, have dialogues with other spaces. Like, I'm really a big fan of bringing back regionalism, because I think people now more than ever need to, like, start to claim what their identities are based on who they are, but also, like, where they live, and sort of set the tone for that. So, like, some places don't have a lot of cultural density, but I feel like they do have people, though, and they do have artists. So if the artist had to define, like, what's unique about where they live and the region that they live in, you know, like, how are we mapping that out? And, like, how can curators sort of design different moments, you know, exhibitions or other programming, etc., different initiatives, research-based initiatives, like, to actualize that in real time. Because I feel like something that I feel like I've been really spoiled to see is, like, archives live in MFA programs at Tulane, and, like, things that I can witness like that's already sort of been designed in real time. And I sort of, like, ask myself, like, how much further can we push it? But, like, when I was in the Midwest for those 2 years, like, when I would go to archival institution, it was very passively, like, just sitting there. And I was like, oh, I'm really spoiled to think that everywhere is, like, what I'm used to. So yeah, I think about that a lot in my work, is sort of like, how are we engaging other institutions to respond to artists who are just as capable of doing the work and are probably peers of people who are the admin at the institution. Yeah.
So being, you know, Indiana, and then you being in Louisiana, I remember talking to John Waters, and he was like, yeah, I get off the plane in some places and there's the same restaurants and everything looks the same. So with regionalism, and, you know, I do think there is kind of a high art world perception of probably, like, I mean, I think the South probably has more of this interesting identity to the high art world than the Midwest, obviously. But, you know, how do you feel about participating in this creative ecosystem? Because, you know, in the high art world, do you feel like you're part of it? Are you wanting that attention from the coast where you got LA? You know, I get Chicago's probably one of the players too. So you got New York, Chicago, LA. Do you feel like you'll be able to actively participate in the high art world in the South?
Yeah, I think not only will I be able to do it in the South, but I think I'll be able to do it in the Midwest and everywhere else by just like the uniqueness of how I approach my curatorial projects. Like I'm really looking for this. I think the questions that I'm generally asking before I even put together a concept for a show or for any sort of research initiative is like what's the history of that place? Generationally, how has it changed? How's that impacted people? How does that impact like the currents in the culture? And so I feel like with the Midwest, I have specifically thought a lot about like this idea of urban decay. I've thought a lot about in some ways the Midwest can feel sort of frozen in time. Like I think a big conversation that I kept like talking about like the sky like it was falling, like in Kansas City because they're about to get FIFA. And like when I went there, like within months of me getting to Kansas City and like getting settled, like they got a Ferris wheel, and I was like, oh, it's coming. Like, and they're like, what is this Ferris wheel in the middle, like just in the middle of like these two highways? And I'm just like, oh yeah, they're about to build that up, babes. Like the Midwest has maybe moved at a gradual pace post like its industrial era for a long time, or sort of been like at a certain rhythm for maybe the last 15 years. But I'm thinking a lot about like what has that done to like culture, and like what has that done to like our sense of time within a region. And I'm just thinking a lot about that. And so I feel like even between regions, I'm asking the right questions that are like sort of rooted in the histories of the place, but what are like the main social shifts in the place? And so I feel like because there was so much density for me to like have, because I'm from the South, like there's so much point of reference from what I've already explored in the South that when I go to other regions, I'm asking questions that maybe people aren't really asking. But the main thing is like I'm asking artists at the same pace that I'm asking institutions. And so I think that's what's going to make me stand out in the long run, is that people are going to know my ethos before they really know like me. And I kind of like that because I'd rather you know what I can do so that you keep asking questions. I don't care too much to be like famous, although I feel like what I do can make me famous. I'm someone who's like really into yielding my personal power. Like I feel like I can be built to manage fame, but I can't like be only influenced by fame. So I know that's like a very like grandiose way of talking about yourself, but
no,
yeah.
I think you have to be ambitious to, to work in this field.
Yeah. And I think that some of the things that I'm seeing now is like there's sort of like, especially in Atlanta, this like back end pipeline of like the mid-career ready to be established artists like hitting the New York galleries through the galleries that are there in Atlanta, or like a lot of cultural bears that are like specifically like around like the Black masking Indians and things like that are practicing contemporary art. Like you will see them in their works travel as sort of like these culture bearers of New Orleans or the South. Like I think that's already happening, so I can't like take too much credit for that, but what I can say is like I am part of that process and how they're like navigating and questioning their own work. And it's specifically like with emerging artists is like I feel like I'm very instrumental in helping them think about what a mid-career artist or an established artist is outside of the accolade. Like what is that leverage? And I think I feel like the thinking big thing definitely comes from Atlanta, but I feel like the asking the granular questions really comes from like my time in New Orleans and being around New Orleanians. Is like, I think how something happens is so important to people from New Orleans, not just the fact that it gets done. And I feel like I've learned like in almost the last 10 years, like so much from that. So I think that's the thing that I bring to the table no matter where I go, is sort of like how I've been impacted, but also just how I see sort of these like pipelines. And so my criticism of that really informs like my approach.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was really why I wanted to have you in our space was, I felt like, I really thought you were very thoughtful and saw everything from a unique perspective than different from mine. And then also, I think you're comfortable with debate and willing to defend what you see and think. And can you talk about why you're comfortable with debate and how, some people take it personal, but it's not when people disagree. Can you talk about your debate skills? And I think it's served your work really well.
Yeah, I really describe Atlanta and how it just grew too fast as it kind of started in this place of hotep capitalism, where it was all you gotta have multiple businesses and you gotta get a G-Wagon and write it off because it's heavy, and just you gotta get rich and we gotta save the community, and those things come from actual real cultural cultural influences in specific neighborhoods, and these sort of collective efforts to mobilize people, but also to maintain the social statuses of people. But what I saw is that just the timeline sort of jumped. And so I feel I grew up because I grew up on the north side of Atlanta. I had friends who were from Sandy Springs, but I was not a rich person from Sandy Springs. I just lived over there. So 40% of my friends maybe lived in the north side. And then I spent a lot of other people from old Atlanta will tell you oh, I didn't really leave my neighborhood. But I was on MARTA all the time. I was on the train and the bus all the time to see my friends. I would ask, I would agree to go to church with people on the weekends so I could stay over there. I spent a lot of time really bouncing around to have to get to know people. So I feel I always had the privilege of I met these people in a place where we're all sort of here to better our futures and go to schools on the north side of Atlanta. I kind of just if anyone has seen the movie ATL, is my friend group was primarily Esquires, and Esquire lived in Mechanicsville on the west side of Atlanta, but had a scholarship and used a fake address to go to this private school in Sandy Springs. And then when one of the main characters Nunu, she's just this girl that goes by Cascade to the skating rink, but nobody really knows where she lives, and the whole time she lives in Sandy Springs. And then because Esquire is trying to get a letter of recommendation from her dad, and then he's you got a Picasso in your house. I feel that I relate to that experience so much, just because it's people I had a lot of friends who were Esquires, but when they would go home, they went home to these really culturally dense communities that had elders, that had some were more white collar, some were more blue collar, some were more mixed income. And I feel the rigor of my academia made me very critical and analytical, but the experience, having to experience that with peers who had all these different diverse social backgrounds, and then also being with them after school, I feel that shaped me a lot. And then going to HBCU, I feel that also played a big part in it too. And then just mostly being in the South my whole life, but having these really socially privileged experiences in the South, where it's I understand the rules, but the way I abide to the rules inform me to create something new. I feel that really built up my confidence. And so I feel I argue from a place of confidence. And so even if I'm wrong, I can be wrong. That's fine. But I'm not uninformed. You can't that's not I think that's not I don't fight from an insecure place. I fight from an informed place. So I think that's what makes me so confident, and even makes me really passionate, because I feel I get really frustrated when people don't have confidence, or when people are overlooked. I get really frustrated when people are sort of agreeing to binaries because they're just trying to succeed. I feel I was frustrated with all of those things at a really young age, and I had peers that were there to be it's not that serious, because for us it wasn't, because so many of us were sort of figuring out mobility and success in all these different ways. And so, yeah, I think it really just comes from a place of like confidence. It comes from how I was raised, and it comes from like also like, because in a lot of ways, I guess I was displaced from Atlanta. Like my family hasn't lived on the north side in a long time. Like my family lives in like Stone Mountain now. They live like on the east side. But yeah, so I feel like as an adult, like I came to New Orleans like primarily because I was displaced, but also because I wanted to live there. But I really kind of like had a slim margin of just like, it was like a very like close window. It's like, do you want to struggle and keep trying to figure this thing out in Atlanta, or do you want to try something new in New Orleans and like maybe not compete with such like with the wealth gap that was widening so much in Atlanta, and really try to figure out, because Atlanta is a place where you can like pop off, but from the ground up it's really hard to mobilize everybody, because now like more transplants live in Atlanta than people born and raised there. Yeah, like it was about, the metro population is probably the size of what India is now. When I was growing up, about like 2 million, which was big. It had grown since the 90s and the Olympics when it happened there. But from the time I was in high school to now, it grew 4 million people. Oh. Like, so it's really hard to mobilize people without this idea of performativity or like merit or excellence. Like that's the thing that makes people pay attention to you. But I feel like when I moved to New Orleans, I learned like a lot more about like how to connect your nuance to other people's nuance and not just be special and unique or be like a go-getter. Like I actually like the second time that I was living there full time in New Orleans, I got a lot of criticism about how I was too selfish, but I didn't feel like I was selfish. But to them, it was like, you think blindly. That's what they were telling me. And then I guess in a sense, like it's true, because I don't know people and I'm trying to like be in their space by being like this merit-based person or being this high achiever or this high performer. And they're like, you can do that, but that doesn't mean we have to like you. And like that, I call it humble pie. Like Damon Davis had said that to me like a couple of months ago. It was like, humble pie will really change the course of your life. And it really did. Like it really like sort of like the things that I found that I was really frustrated with, I got to sort of also like reflect internally a lot because I'm in someone else's environment. So yeah, like I learned a lot in my time in New Orleans and still learning. But even like as I'm like doing things in New Orleans, like people in Atlanta are like, oh, what are you doing over there? Like, you know, so kind of being able to bounce back in between these places. But I think the sort of thing that keeps me wanting to like lean into how I approach things more is like this idea of like, when I come back, I'm going to come back to Atlanta. Like when I come back, I'm going to come back very strong. And when I leave New Orleans, I don't have to feel like I just gave something up. Like people will know like that I should be trusted. So yeah, that's sort of the paradigm running in my head. And I'm just like, as I think about like going to Indianapolis or going to Kansas City or going to Chicago, going to LA, going to New York, it's like I take that with me. And I think that's also why like before I took my last fellowship, I felt like, oh, I had all of these connections. Like people know how I think, but they don't know what I do just yet. And so, yeah, I just think over time, like I'm definitely going to be running things, but I don't think I'll be the only one running it. And I'm like really excited about that because I feel like free thinkers need peers. So that's definitely like, I feel like if you don't establish yourself as a free thinker, and if you are not able to be humbled as a free thinker, you won't have real support with people that are like, that can share something with you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm excited. Our show is opening, or your show is opening, September 5th with us and runs through October 19th. SOMA at Tube Factory Artspace, 1125 Cruft Street. Before we sign off, what are you watching right now? Are there any artists you want to share that you're watching or keeping an eye on right now?
Yes. Okay. One person I really, really love that moved to New Orleans after Katrina and I think is doing like some of the most amazing collage work I've ever seen is an artist named Candace Caston, who's currently based in Atlanta but is from the Gentilly area in New Orleans. I'm just so excited to see everything she does. Like whenever I see her collages, I know exactly like, oh, that's the lakefront. Like I just, but I feel like the way she is like really taking the time to abstract these different components of her collages, I think is really in that Southern vernacular that I'm thinking about a lot. I'm really excited about Blassie Saucy. We've worked together quite a bit, but they're a Peruvian artist they were based in New Orleans and did the Sam Fox Fellowship at WashU, but now they're based in Greensboro, North Carolina. So they were also a featured artist in Prospect. So I'm really excited to see what their next body of work is, because they're someone who's really working on like sort of figurative sculptures that are not explicitly figurative, but sort of merge land, body, past and present, and like merging time, collapsing time, and this idea of futurism within their works. I'm trying to think one more person that's like from Atlanta that I'm like, I'm so glad you're from Atlanta. Like, oh, Rita Harper. She's a photographer and a photojournalist. She's also like my big sister. Like she's from the south side of, she went to Tri-Cities High School where Outkast went, but she's based in New Orleans now. And I just feel like she's so anointed to do like photojournalism work. Like she gets sent to a lot of like these other Black meccas that are in the South and is like really doing like real journalism with her photo work. And is getting assigned to do it. And I just feel like had it been anyone else, I'd been like, oh, great, they want to surveil us. Like, but with Rita, I'm just like, she's made for that. So yeah, those are artists that I'm really excited about.
All right. Is there anything you want to recommend reading or watching wise to the audience?
You know, I feel like I've read it before, but recently I just finished rereading Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. And I feel like anyone who's trying to navigate authority should be reading that. I'm a big proponent of, like, I'm a big Bell Hooks, like, follower. Like, when she died, a lot of people, like, were posting photos of themselves reading all about love. And I'm just like, she wrote more than a self-help book, y'all. Like, please respect this woman. But I would read that. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one. I always say start with Bell Hooks. Maybe Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson for people trying to understand like how capitalism has collapsed into itself many times over. But yeah, that's where I guess I'm at right now with reading.
All right. Well, thank you, Yashi. We will open Yashi's show September 5th through October 19th. SOMA, don't miss it. And our website is www.tubefactory.org. We're open Wednesday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., Saturdays and Sundays, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So you have time if you can't make it to the opening reception on the 5th of September, 6 to 10 p.m. Thank you again. This was an interview with Yashi Davalos, guest curator here for SOMA.
Thank you for having me.